The CAA just released a consultation document about flying of drones after 2026. Now, there are lots of questions in here that seem to point towards the sub 250 gram drone category being severely restricted in the future. If you don't want this to happen, you need to watch this video and you need to reply to the consultation document. It might also result in smaller drones and larger drones being lumped into one subcategory that is far away from people, which again, we don't want. You might be getting this video pushed to you because you watch audit videos. In many audit videos, you see auditors using drones. To me, that's how I'm connected to this, through the drones. I'm not a huge fan of auditors, but I've got to say that quite often they know the rules. And in 90% of the cases, they fly perfectly legally, apart from a few small cases, but I can talk about those later. So mostly we agree. I don't want any more rules personally. I don't want any more restrictions. Sub 250 gram drones are great because they allow you to fly over people, and you can do this relatively safely. This document that was released a couple of weeks ago, there's actually a web form to go with that to fill in, but it's really quite complex. And thanks to Sean at Geeksvana, they've released an email address you can actually send these replies to. If you're into sub 250 gram drones, like many of the community are, you want to look at question 7 and question 13 specifically. If you specifically just want to respond to those questions, then I'll put the address on the screen now. So this document was released a couple of weeks ago and it needs to be responded to by the 7th of September, which isn't far away now, so you've really got to do it. It's quite difficult to understand, and I'm going to go through my answers in this video. There are 17 questions to answer, but if you want to just answer the 2 or 3 that are relevant to sub 250 gram drones, you can do that. I'm going to look at all the questions and my responses to them, but also I'm going to leave what I've actually responded in the description of this video. Now, I would suggest if you're into drones, you need to respond to this. It's absolutely vital for our hobby, and if you use drones for business, again, vital to respond to this, because this will change the shape of how we use drones in the future. They talk about C-class drones, and they talk about sub 250 gram drones. We talk about open categories if they need to be changed. We even talk about remote ID. How do you fancy that? Right, so let's get into the video. So let's look at the questions. Now, this comes actually with a complete document that tells you about the questions. So again, I'll put the link in the description to that, which will be down there somewhere. I'm not going to go into massive detail, but I'm going to look at the questions and I'm going to look at my answers to that. So question 1, do you agree with the challenges and operational requirements identified by the stakeholders and why? Well, like I say, I'll put the link to the actual document itself so you can read it, which I recommend you doing. So my responses to this is, I believe it can be complex for drone users to work out correct places to fly and requirements for their UAS. This should be easy to understand for all members of the public and UAS flyers, UAS being unmanned aerial systems. I believe it can be complex for drone users to work out the correct places to fly and requirements for their UAS. This should be easy to understand for all drone users as well as members of the public, who are often fed out-of-date information. I do not believe it really causes any safety or privacy concerns beyond legislation that already exists. No evidence for this exists or is shown. Question 2, should the CAA adopt the following policy objectives for operational requirements, and why? Mitigate safety and risks, user-centric, enforceable, growth enabling, scalable. Please describe other objectives we should consider. Bit vague. The UAS has a very good safety record in the past, and with the lighter and smarter UAS coming to the market, this is only set to improve. I don't believe this is a problem at all, and I don't see any evidence for tighter restrictions or regulations. The rules should always be easy to understand, and we already have enforceable rules. If you don't agree with this at any point, don't reply in the video, reply to the CAA. Yeah, because this is just what I think. You should have your own thoughts and do what you think and reply as you want to. Question 3, do you value international alignment in operational requirements and why? Yes, I do. We've been talking about C-class drones for the past couple of years. C-class drones come out, and this happens pretty much a week later. The CAA or Department of Transport withdraw C-class drones. So a bit of a nightmare. But anyway, let's get back to my answer. So yes, we should be using C-class UAS like the Eurozone, with no barrier to manufacturers having to build a specific UAS. So in the consultation document, they talk about this potentially being a barrier, but we've got people building them now. DJI have released, the last few drones have been C1 or C2 class rated. Yes, we should be using C-class EOS like the Eurozone, with no barrier to manufacturing to build UK specific EOS. This with the same or better permissions as we would enjoy in the EU. I would also like to see my qualifications being valid in the EU as well as EU qualifications being valid here. The whole C-class debacle is a political own goal. So let me know, would you like your flyer ID and your operator ID to be valid in Europe? I mean, you see so many questions about what do I need to fly in Germany or in Europe or wherever, you know, and previously my GVC or A2 of CFC would have been valid there, but not anymore, which is really frustrating. Likewise, people coming from Europe need to specifically register their drone operator ID and their flyer ID to fly in this country. So it should be the same, really, in my opinion. Question 4. So should the CAA rename operational categories and subcategories, and why? So here they talk about the open categories, so A1, A2 and A3. So A1 is basically over people, A2 is close to people, and A3 is far from people. There we go. We've got some new category titles, which make life so much easier. Would be great to have a simple naming structure, i.e. over people, close to people or far from people. Question number 5, here where it gets a little bit more complex. Should the CAA simplify how operational requirements are categorized and why? If you bring drones that are flying in the A3 category over here into the A1 category, so A3 category drones could be up to 25 kilos in the open category, and allowing them to fly in the A1 subcategory would seem daft because that would be quite a risk. So what you wonder is whether they're going to take the A1 subcategory drones flying in that category like the sub 250 gram drones and make them fly in the A3 subcategory, and that's the real worry. So this is my response. Why combine the A1 and A3 subcategories? I see no logic in having much larger drones fly closer to people, but drones that say are less than 1 kilo, like the C1 drones, could be flown closer to people, C1 class. The only logic I see in this question, if you're looking to abolish A1 subcategory and remove those permissions, which I would very strongly disagree with. Question number 6. Should the CAA update how model aircraft operations are regulated and why? Now, I've got no direct experience of model aircraft, but from what I understand, they are mostly flown at flying fields where you've got a club that flies, and that's a fixed location. And you would think if you've got a fixed location, you've got a known risk because people will know that they are there, you know, and so why not have a little bit more freedom for them? And that's reflected in my answer. I don't know much about model aircraft, but from what I know, they fly from club locations, so it's easier to mitigate the risks to other air users through geofencing and maybe should be treated more favourably. Question number 7. Should the CAA simplify exclusions from operational requirements? And why? Please describe any alternatives, exclusions that should be considered. So they kind of talk about sub 250 gram drones that are excluded from the C1 classes, and there's quite a lot here actually to look at if you look at the document itself, which is kind of 28 pages long. I didn't print it all. They talk about the confusion around sub 250 gram drones, whether it's confusing to have, you've got toy drones that don't need a flyer ID or operator ID. If it's got a camera, it needs an operator ID. And they talk about confusion. The confusion is more of their making, really. 99% of the people understand that you need an operator ID if you're flying a sub 250 gram drone with a camera. And it's not a toy. Seems to make sense. But it seems that the CAA might want to make this simpler by giving more restrictions. So here's my response. No simplification is needed. It's quite obvious which sub 250 gram drones are toys and which are not. I feel they do not offer any sort of security risk, personal data risk, other than a tiny minority who use drones to antagonize people for video views. Okay, auditors. This should be dealt with under current legislation, e.g. GDPR and the Air Navigation Order and geofencing sensitive areas. So if you don't want somebody to fly over the police station, then give it a geofence. You know, make it so that you cannot do that. But really, for most drone flyers, this wouldn't be effective because nobody wants to fly over an industrial estate or a police station. I understand why You'd want some areas are sensitive, and that's fine. But why produce laws specifically for sub 250 gram drones when you can just make a geofence? What's an issue is the lack of geofencing on some sub 250 gram drones, as well as the inaccurate geofencing that DJI implement. And in my opinion, is also there's no basic requirement for a flyer ID on a sub 250 gram drone, and that would at least tell you or help you work out where you can fly. This could be dealt with by having better and more accurate geofencing, as well as a requirement to know how to check airspace through an official CAA app. Now, again, we don't have an official CAA sanctioned app to check where your airspace is. We have Altitude Angel, which shows the official airspace. The CAA actually stopped funding that app a couple of years ago, and it wasn't funded, and now Altitude Angel are building it for themselves, and in fact it is better. But why do the CAA not actually have their own app? Wouldn't it make life so much easier? Question number 8. Should the CAA change transitional arrangements for users of EOS without class marks, and why? We should accept the class markings on currently produced C-class drones and not wait until 2026, and potentially another different class marking system. We should do it right away. If the UK decided to produce its own C-class system, which was different to that in the EU or substantially different, this would unlikely result in any drones being produced because the UK is such a small market. So authorization and risk assessment, this is mainly for the specific category. We talk about operational authorization, which doesn't really make sense because this is a consultation about the open category. Strange, but there's also requirements in there, or talk about requirements for additional competency, additional training. If you've done your A2 CFC, you've done your GVC, there was going to be a beyond visual line of sight qualification actually that's kind of not materialized, but they're on about 2 additional competencies in there, which I kind of think, well, what's the point? Having had an operational authorization in the past, I can say it's a very complex process. Standardizing things for the majority of users would be beneficial. I do feel for some where the operational safety case, the OSC, is very specific and will need a way of submitting that separately. So there are some people which have got very specific needs that maybe a web form wouldn't work for. So question number 9. Do you agree with the challenges identified by the stakeholders relating to products, requirements, and why? Not at all. I don't see any presented evidence for this. C-class markings were a brilliant idea and not a complex at all. Most would be flying the C0 or C1 mark drone that were intended to come with information about where you can fly. Why did we drop this idea? It's not a barrier to manufacturers as they're already in production. It would be more complex if the CAA decided to have UK specific markings. Question number 10. Should the CAA adopt policy objectives for production requirements, and why? Mitigate safety, security risk, user-centric growth, like earlier questions. So they're already mitigating security risks and can do more effectively with geofencing and C-class marked drones. They should be more user-centric and internationally aligned. Question number 11. Should the CAA implement manufacturer standards, and why? So in question number 11, we're really looking at merging C-class drones. So instead of having C1 and C3, you'd have just one class. And again, that worries me because they won't give permissions to C3 class. Why would you have that flying in a more congested area? So really keeping the C1 and C2 and C3, you can at least fly a drone where it's ideally suited for, and not removing permissions for the C1 and C2 and effectively just pushing it into C3. So this seems to be what they're trying to do, is again remove permissions for lighter drones and push them all into that C3 or that A3 subcategory, which is 150 meters away from recreational, residential and commercial areas. So I've put, this makes no sense. There are a system of class markings that clearly states where you can fly. It's a step backwards, merging C1 and C3 class of a different challenges and risks. Question number 12. Should the CAA implement product labelling scheme, and why? Well, yes, we had C-class markings. Why did we lose them? So yes, we should adopt the C-class markings. Question number 13. Should the CAA simplify exclusions from product requirements? and why. So this again is talking about sub 250 gram drones and excluding them from the C-class systems. I mean, a sub 250 gram drone technically is a legacy drone, but it can be flown, or could have been flown, beyond, indefinitely. It doesn't need a C-class marking. In theory, that would be a C0 drone if it was marked with a C-class label. The provisions around sub 250 gram drones works well, aside from lack of training needed to fly one. See question 7. So again, I feel we should have a flyer ID to fly any drone, unless it's a toy, in which case you don't need it. But for a sub 250 gram drone, we should have flyer IDs. So question 14, should the CAA implement remote ID, and why? So I disagree. You already have technology and powers to catch illegal flights. Having every bit of flight data will make every pilot try and second guess how anybody viewing the data might interpret it, and not focus on performing the flight in a safe and controlled way. If your purpose is to catch criminals, then this won't happen, as there will be a way around this with homemade or legacy drones. Also, what happens with the data? Do you sell it to the highest bidder so they can trawl through it to find any potential infringement and send out fines? How long would it be kept for? No. Just don't agree with it. Question 15. Should the CAA implement geo-awareness, and why? Well, geo-awareness, geo-fences, it's already been poorly implemented by DJI, but it would be a great thing actually if it were done correctly. So if DJI could just cut and paste the UK airspace into their drones, that would be brilliant. It would stop a lot of the unintentional flights where people don't realise they're in flight restricted airspace. I actually made a video specifically about this. If you look at Farnborough Airport, for instance, in the DJI app, there is no geofence around that, but if you look at Drone Assist, there is. Easy mistake to make. If you trust the DJI maps, please don't. Please download Altitude Angels Drone Assist app, and at least you can then follow the correct UK airspace. But if they did it properly, then yeah, it's a brilliant idea. Of course, the trouble is that you couldn't necessarily implement NOTAMs, which wouldn't necessarily be shown, so you'd still need to check the airspace. But if you get like regular fixed airports on there, then that would really work. So I've put absolutely just make the maps up to date. DJI Maps does not reflect UK airspace and needs a lot of work to make it fit for purpose, but people do follow it. Question 16. Should CAA introduce requirements for manufacturers to provide user guidance during product setup or pre-flight via the controller or other interface? Well, yes, I think it's already a thing with C-class drones. DJI, for instance, goes through a setup process that restricts your height and distance until you've gone through some basic learning steps, which is a good thing. Question 17. Should the CAA introduce user validation requirements on manufacturers? This is whether you have to prove you have an operator ID before it'll let you activate or fly the drone. Kind of in principle, I don't disagree, but I think it'd just be awkward to implement, so here's my answer. Where a flyer ID or operator ID is required, I would be in favour of validation process. This could only be done for new drones, so it may be of little value. Criminals who you are targeting most will not be affected by this and will learn how to circumvent this anyway. As far as auditors are concerned that use drones, to me, most of their flights, like I said earlier, are not illegal. They fly over industrial estates, they fly over buildings. I wouldn't fly above a police station, and I don't really think they should either, but you could geofence that. But where I think that the law isn't being used is around the air navigation order, people taking off and landing from public spaces when you've got potential of people walking into those spaces because it's a public space. A footpath is for feet and for people walking, not to fly drones from, really. But it's not necessarily illegal, but you need to be taking care. And that's where I think, and that's the thing that I don't think is necessarily happening with some auditors. So what I'm saying is the laws are there already to deal with auditors. We don't need any more flight restrictions for a minority of people. If you're into the auditors, then tell me, what do you watch? Because ultimately people don't watch the drone footage. They're not really interested in that. The drone is being used. Auditor goes in to the security office. I'm going to do a video about your site. Okay, the security guard will say, that's fine, off you go, just do it from outside. Oh yeah, and I'm going to fly a drone above your building. And that's where the issue is. So it's not that drones are being used. If you were to go down an industrial estate and just fly above each one, do it without telling anybody, you wouldn't get any problems. And we wouldn't be having this in the consultation. There would be no issue about this. But the trouble is that people go in, drone, put the drone in someone's face so that you get an angry face, and people watch the confrontations. And tell me if I'm wrong. What do you watch if you watch an audit video? Do you watch the drone flight, or do you watch the confrontation? You know the answer to that. The bigger the confrontation, the bigger the video. So that encourages any auditor to go and make the confrontation bigger, to make the annoyance bigger. And that is the problem. And that's what this document in some ways is trying to stop. You shouldn't be restricting all drone flyers for a tiny minority when there are rules already to restrict that tiny minority. Anyway, like I said, you need to submit this by the 7th of September. I'll put a link here for the email address again. Do it as soon as possible. If you're into drones, if you fly drones, please submit it. Check out Geeksvana. I know they're going to do a video about this, and so I'll be interested to see that. Ian from London, I think, has done one as well. As a drone flyer, you've got to do this. And if you like the auditors, then probably do this as well, because you are potentially a stakeholder. But if you want to reply to questions 7 and 13, then please do. If you want to watch somebody about drones and how you can fly them in more places, that's me. So if you like that sort of stuff, give us a thumbs up, give us a subscribe. But I'm not here to like put the boot into auditors all the time. Not my thing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.